drash, we're dealing with Asara Betevet, the fast day that we just observed on the calendar. I actually want to tell the story by going back to 2 Kings, where this story is first told from the perspective of the people living in Judah. And it names the 10th day of the 10th month, Asara Betevet, in the 9th year of Tzidkiyahu's reign, in about the year 588 BCE. At that time, Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king, began a siege of Jerusalem. And 18 months later, on the 17th day of Tammuz, at the end of the 11th year of Tzidkiyahu's reign, in 586 BCE, he broke through the city walls. That date of the 17th of Tammuz is the same date centuries later that the Romans broke through on the walls of the rebuilt temple, and the siege of Jerusalem ended with the destruction of the temple on the 9th of Av, both for the first temple and for the second temple. So I want to tell you the story. It's a real kind of true crime, horror story, and it reads, keeping you on the edge of your seat. This I'm quoting now from 2 Kings. In the 9th year of his reign, on the 10th day of the month, Nebuchadnezzar moved against Jerusalem with his whole army. He besieged it, and they built towers against it all around. The city continued in a state of siege until the 11th year of King Zedekiah. By the 9th day of the 4th month, the famine had become acute in the city. There was no food left for the common people. This is also reminding us, of course, of the story of Joseph, where Joseph plans for a time of famine. And it might remind us, too, of humanitarian conditions in Gaza. Then the wall of the city was breached. All the soldiers left the city by night through the gate between the double walls, which is near the king's garden. The Chaldeans were all around the city. The king set out for the Arava. But the Chaldean troops pursued the king. This is the king of Judah. And they overtook him in the steps of Jericho as his entire force left him and scattered. They captured the king and brought him before the king of Babylon, and they put him on trial. First, they slaughtered King Tzidkiyahu's sons before his eyes, and then his eyes were put out. He was chained in bronze fetters, and he was brought to Babylon. On the 7th day of the 5th month, that was the 19th year of King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, the chief of guards and officer of the king of Babylon came to Jerusalem. He burned the house of God, the king's palace, and all the houses of Jerusalem. He burned down the house of every notable person. Kol Beit Gadol. The entire Chaldean force that was with the chief of the guard tore down the walls of Jerusalem on every side. The remnant of the people that was left in the city, the defectors who had gone over to the king of Babylon, and the remnant of the population were taken into exile by Nebuchadnezzar, the chief of guards. But some of the poorest in the land were left by the chief of the guards to be vine dressers and field hands. The Chaldeans broke up the bronze columns of the house of God, the stands, the bronze tank that was in the house of God. They carried the bronze away to Babylon. They also took all the pails, the scrapers, the snuffers, the ladles, all the bronze vessels, and all the gold, and whatever was of silver, fire pans and sprinkling bowls, 2 columns, 1 tank, the stands that Solomon provided for the house of God, all these objects beyond weighing. The chief of the guards also took Seraiah, the chief priest, and Zephaniah, the deputy priest, and the 3 guardians of the threshold. And from the city he took a eunuch who was in command of the soldiers, 5 of the royal privy counselors who were present in the city, the scribe of the army who was in charge of mustering the people of the land, and 60 of the common people who were inside the city. And then the chief of the guards took them and brought them to the king of Babylon. And the king of Babylon had them struck down and put to death. Thus Judah was exiled from the land. It's just a brutal tale of the overturning of one great civilization by another. And normally in the course of history, you would expect that to be the end of the Jews, but of course it wasn't. And I wanted to call attention to some elements of the story that I see and how they're applying in some ways to Israel today, as well as I mentioned to our Torah portion. And I made these go in the order of the alphabet. So first is A for anguish. There's so much pain in this story. There's blood, there's cruelty, there's this very strong visual imagery, the king being carried out in bronze chains, and then all the bronze that Solomon had created for the temple, and all the silver and the gold carried out. And there's so much anguish attached to this because it's regarded as the beginning of a chain of events that culminates in the siege and the starvation, but then the destruction of the temple, the total exile from the land, and even presages the destruction of the second temple too. It's a time of unique upset, and I feel that same thing is going on in Israel. I listened this week to Daniel Sokach, head of the New Israel Fund, who's famously progressive left person. And the opening remark in his 1-hour webinar was, after visiting Israel just this past week, you have to understand that in Israel, it is still October 7th. I have heard so many people say that, but I didn't expect it to come from Daniel Sokach too. That the trauma is so deep and so fresh and so significant. It's not just the loss of a wall in Jerusalem or the loss of, one place to worship. It's the threatened end of Jewish civilization at the time of Nebuchadnezzar, and for Israelis also today. Second thing that was interesting to me in rereading this section of Kings is that you can see a brain drain. That's my B. Who was killed? At first, the king, the leading intellectuals and advisors, the military heads, the priests, the scribe of the army. And who was allowed to continue to live? The farmhands, the people who were called lo gedolim, the not great. In Israel, there's been a threat of a brain drain against Netanyahu and against the right-wing government, against particularly what was regarded as a judicial power grab. Military leaders said, we're not doing it. We're not coming to your aid. Academics, legal scholars, cultural icons in Israel said, this is going to be the end. And a lot of young startup, high-tech workers said, if this goes through, we're leaving Tel Aviv for Silicon Valley or Austin, Texas, or some other tech hub. I see a conflation in the story of Asara Betevet with earlier problems. And I see that in Israel today too. The 10th of Tevet today is celebrated as a fast day, not just for the story that's told in this part of the Bible and elsewhere, but because of other things that happened on that approximate date. On the 8th of Tevet, in the 3rd century BCE, there was what many regard as a triumph and others regard as a tragedy, the translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek. At that time, the Egyptian Greek Emperor Ptolemy II gathered 72 Jewish scholars and ordered them to translate the Bible into Greek. And the miracle was that in 72 separate corners, they all came up with exactly the same translation. They also all fudged in all the right same places, apparently, because they were afraid of certain consequences and misunderstandings if they gave it a literal translation. And in the Talmud, it says that this day when the Torah was translated into Greek was as bad as the day of the golden calf, because it opened up the possibility of misunderstanding God and idolatry as far as the rabbis were concerned. So that's one thing that we're mourning, the misunderstanding of the Bible, the potential misunderstandings. And also on the 9th of Tevet, famously Ezra died in about the year 440 BCE. So this time period was considered a kind of a tragic time anyway, and then you added on top of it the disaster that was the 10th of Tevet. We can see that today in Israel too. We started already with problems in the government that preceded the war that Hamas began. We saw the corruption of Netanyahu that preceded, some would say by decades, the loss of real diplomacy, real pursuit of peace between Israelis and Palestinians preceded and is conflated in some ways with the most recent tragedy. So we have the anguish, we have the brain drain, real or threatened, we have the conflation of a variety of problems, and Diaz, we have something quite distinctive, because the Asara Betevet is unique among Jewish fasts in that it is observed even when it falls on a Friday, although it interferes somewhat with Shabbat preparations. We still observe it because it's considered that important. And we have special prayers, slichot, that we recite, a long Avinu Malkeinu and Anenu prayer. We read from the story of the golden calf, and I think equally it's possible to say that this time in Israel's history is distinctive too. And distinctive for the same kind of horrible reasons, because it was perceived as more than just the body count loss, which was horrible enough, more than just people being taken captive in the ancient times and today, which is horrible enough, but beyond that, a kind of a permission, a kind of a releasing of the protection of the Jews. And people keep referring to this time as the greatest massacre since the Holocaust. We're seeing something new and different on college campuses. There is something distinctive about this moment, as well as existential. And the last thing that these episodes have in common, the Asara Betevet experience and the experience we're having today in Israel, is that both were considered, or could be considered, a kind of an early warning system. That's the E. So we have anguish, brain drain, conflation with earlier problems, something very distinctive, and now an early warning. This is the first of holidays that will alert us. As I mentioned, Shiva Asar B'Tammuz is another. counting the 3 weeks, then Tisha B'Av. And not only are we getting an early warning for the loss of the first temple, we're getting an early warning for the loss of the second temple too. There's a sense that the start of something very bad is happening. And maybe it will be possible to get back to Jerusalem, and maybe it won't. And I think today, if we look at these parallels, the main message that I derive is that we can't be complacent. We can't think that we know what this all means yet. We have to keep asking the question, what are we being warned of? It's a process of discernment, and more it will unfold. We know certain things, and there's a lot we don't know. There's a lot yet to discover. What's amazing is that in the ancient world, despite the loss of their king, their leaders, their elites, their homeland, their temple, their wealth, the Jews of Babylonia did not think that was the end of the story. They believed they could turn things around. And I think part of the reason they may have thought that was because of the example in this week's Torah portion. Genesis 45, verses 5 to 7. Joseph says to his brothers when he reveals himself, "Now do not be distressed or reproach yourselves because you sold me here. It was to save life, ki lemichyah, that God sent me ahead of you. It is now 2 years that there have been famine in the land." Remember, it was a 2-year siege. It was a siege that went over the course of 2 years at the time of the first temple. "And there are still 5 years to come in which there shall be no yield from tilling." And then Joseph assures his brothers, "God sent me ahead of you to ensure your survival on earth and to save your lives, lahachayot lachem, in an extraordinary deliverance." So we have this notion, and we've seen it from in the time of Joseph and the time of Tzidkiyahu and Nebuchadnezzar, and we've seen it endless times in Jewish history, that it looked like we would not survive. But God sent some person, some angel, some principle, some kind of hope ahead to ensure our survival on earth and to save our lives in extraordinary deliverance. The message that I want to say here is that we can turn this around. And as I was thinking about this, I kept hearing Robin's voice in my head from the High Holidays on Make the World Turn Around. And forgive me, because I wish we had Robin and not me, but here goes. And you join me if you can. "I don't want to live in a world of darkness. I want to live in a world of light. I don't want to live in a world that's heartless. I want to live in a world of sight. Well, you know, I want to make the world turn around, make the world turn around. Living in a world of justice, living in a world of shame, living in a world of freedom, living in a world of pain. Well, you know, I want to make the world turn around, make the world turn around. Turn the darkness into light, turn the hunger into life, turn the wrong into right, put an end to the strife. Turn the blindness into sight, Save a human life. Make the world turn around. Make the world turn around. Make the world turn around. I heard a beautiful and heartbreaking statement by a bishop, one of the last Christian communities in Gaza, who said, we won't have peace with God until we have peace with our brothers and even with our enemies. We're all heading toward Echad. We've got to turn this division around into oneness.